Did you know how easy it is to scare people in the modern age? You used to have to say something along the lines of, I know about the sex trafficking ring you ran 4 years ago, but nowadays a copy of Mario 64 does the trick. What have we come to? Horror was and still is a pretty divisive and subjective genre in media. What you and I may find scary, the vast majority of people might not, and that's completely normal. It's the exact reason why phobia terminology exists, and the exact reason why I couldn't convince my friends to go see the new Candyman movie with me when it came out. But what happens when we find non-horror media scary? By that, I mean something that's not intended to be unsettling, but very much is for an undefined yet unanimous reason. It might be because of janky and bad animation, or weird-looking CGI, but some of it just lies forever on the cusp of mystery and undefinedness. This phenomenon, or subgenre of horror, if you can even name it that, is what I like to call unintentional horror. And today, in this video, I'd like to take a moment of your time to look at the history of this very overlooked and not talked about aspect of media, and its use primarily in video games. One popular aspect of unintentional horror in video games that you probably know about is that it's pretty much the root of any and almost all gaming-related creepypastas. Lavender Town Syndrome came up because someone thought that the Lavender Town theme was creepy. Ben drowned? Someone thought that the Link statue from Majora's Mask seemed a bit off. Herobrine? Someone thought that they were being followed in Minecraft. All of these examples are of people taking seemingly innocent or accidentally off-putting things from games and running with them and turning them into horrific horror stories. This phenomenon also came up a lot recently with the rising popularity of gaming iceberg charts, where people would leave down certain aspects of games that freaked them out or left them disturbed that probably weren't made with that purpose in mind. For example, in the very popular Mario 64 iceberg video that jump-started the whole iceberg craze on YouTube, there was a specific entry named Wet Dry World Negative Emotional Aura that described the Mario level as terrifying and deeply unsettling. Quote unquote, it had Ghost Town vibes. While I never personally felt the same way about Wet Dry World when I played it as a kid, it still speaks to the very subjectivity of the occurrence mentioned previously. Now that we've covered the effects of unintentional horror, we can now discuss the causes of this effect. Let's start with Wet Dry World and Minecraft and whatever the hell Ghost Town vibes are. The feature that both of these game worlds have in common is that they are both somewhat dystopian. Wet Dry World takes place on top of a sunken city with an abundance of non-human funny little guys who want to kill you. And the supposed town you find is dead empty with no human-like trace to be found. All combined with the seemingly empty and bleak buildings found in the background of the world, it does make for somewhat of an eerie experience when you think about it. Minecraft is similar too. You're just a small man in an, again, giant, endless dystopian world that only inhabits things that want to kill you or scam you out of your hard-earned gems. Come on, don't tell me you never heard of and didn't get a little shiver down your spine. Though, the thing that both of these examples have in common is the prevalent use of liminal spaces. Liminal spaces are often described as places connecting different states of being, emotionally and physically, usually taking place between big transitional periods in your life. It might be after a breakup, after moving houses, after graduating high school and having absolutely zero idea what you're going to do next. Generally, it represents states in your life that might cause feelings of unpreparedness, nervousness, and above all, change. Though what you probably associate with the term liminal spaces are most likely images like these that have blown up over the past couple of years online. They are recognized by their mostly empty, desolate depictions of familiar, almost recognizable places that have some kind of dark or negative aura to them. The most common examples of new wave liminal spaces are empty halls, playgrounds, endless empty suburban houses, and mysterious architecture. Although these derive away a bit from the classic definition of liminal spaces, these images still hold the same themes of uneasiness and discomfort. They represent places out of context. Malls and airports are supposed to be well lit and filled to the brim with busy people running around and doing things. But out of their normal context, something about it feels off. It's the same reason why people get creeped out by Wet Dry World. Cities are supposed to be blistering with life and people and businesses, yet in Wet Dry World, we don't see what we often associate with cities, and instead are greeted with a desolate, lonely shell of a town that has been trapped underwater for God knows how long. It gives Ghost Town vibes to a T, and it raises many questions. What happened to the people who live down here? Did they drown? Why are we rewarded by the game for discovering this? Are the stars we receive remnants of the townspeople's final wishes? And are we setting them free by completing their tasks? And most importantly, how did the goddamn tree survive? We as humans are objectively afraid of the unknown and the ambiguous, and the feeling that liminal spaces evoke is that of mystery, and that's why they scare us so much and the reason that people find horror in games and other media that don't intend it. But also, don't read me wrong, there are plenty of games and horror-based media that utilize liminal spaces to their advantage. Take a look at Silent Hill, it's practically liminal space as a game. Do you not see this fog? Liminal spaces aren't the only way games can unintentionally scare us, though. As said before, many things that we don't understand or that leave us with feelings of ambiguity don't go over well fear-wise in our minds. And that's where the uncanny valley comes in. When you look at modern AAA video game designs and models, most of them feel at least polished or brand-friendly. This wasn't always the case, though, especially near the beginning of video game history. You'd go into Walmart and buy the Atari version of the Indy 500 only to pop it into your console and see this. They sort of look like cars if you're schizophrenic. Video game graphics up until the late 90s were rough, putting it lightly. It's not like the developers weren't putting enough effort in or anything, it's just that the technology wasn't there yet. Even after the Atari era, video games refused to look normal for a while. 2D video games somewhat found their footing in the early 90s with the 16-bit era, but the jump to 3D was incredibly rough. When the technology finally was there, devs were still not entirely sure what to make of it. Groundwork had to be laid for 3D gaming, and what was laid was a massive revelation and phenomenon for the time. But revisiting it in modern day can be, again, rough. Muddy textures, janky controls, strange looking models, this guy. It was just a different era. Some people, me included, can appreciate the nostalgic and atmospheric aesthetics that the hardware limitations of the time brought, while others tend to get a little creeped out. At the time of creation, these designs were the bar for graphics. People didn't think it could get any better than this. So it makes sense that these unforgivable blobs of Pandora found their way into existence, but it still really doesn't make the creepiness they emanate go away. Now, why is that? In my opinion, it falls underneath the wide umbrella term that is the uncanny valley. If you are unfamiliar with the uncanny valley, I'd like to bring up this very helpful infographic made by GMM, which displays the concept simply. When designing characters or cartoons, there is a level of realism used that almost every design falls into. When these characters don't attempt to be too realistic, the designs aren't considered creepy, but right around 70% realism, some hole in the matrix breaks. When our banana monkey-ass brains see or recognize something that almost looks human, but not quite human, let me tell you, it does not go well. Our brain likes to know and recognize exact facial expressions to determine other people's intentions and emotions, and when we can't exactly 100% pin it down, we tend to go into panic mode. It's the same exact reaction we give when we see people with fully face-covered masks on. We can't exactly tell their intentions, and it makes our brains go a little brokey. And just as there is a dip in likability around 70% realism, I believe there is another dip around the other end of the spectrum that includes things that are attempting to be human or use human aesthetics, but don't come off as it in the slightest. And I believe that's where a lot of 64-bit models and early gaming graphics fall into. Take for example the Russian soldiers in GoldenEye 007. That thing definitely does not fit anywhere on the likability spectrum, and it sure as shit isn't realistic. I mean, I could list examples for days, man. The scientists from Half-Life, the moon and this guy from Majora's Mask, the humans from Sonic Adventure. You get the point. Even in modern day, people still find themselves creeped out by non-human looking models. And for an example, look no further than Chipper and Sons Lumber Company, an innocent enough looking indie game about anthropomorphic beavers chopping down wood, which in a scathing review left for the game, a critic by the name of Jim Sterling described the game's beaver models as nightmare fuel. And in a moment of desperation and inspiration, Christian indie developer Scott Cawthon turned the criticism on its head and created the now blockbuster horror franchise Five Nights at Freddy's, which truly deserves an Uncanny Valley video of its own. And now that we've covered the causes and underlying reasons why we feel this way, let's take a look at how these particular horror aesthetics are used in modern day. Besides the growing popularity of liminal spaces and its inclusion in more modern horror media, games that use low fidelity and low poly art styles have slowly been rising in popularity over the past couple of years. While the aesthetic isn't always used in the context of horror, the more popular of the bunch fall into the horror genre. One good example of a game that uses retro graphics to its advantage horror-wise is Lost in Vivo. I originally heard about it through Pyrocynical's review of it on his channel, but after doing more research on it, it is definitely one of the greatest showcases of the aesthetic potential of low poly horror. With its absolutely crude PS1-esque monster designs and drab setting, it truly does almost feel like a spiritual successor to Silent Hill. I'm not copying Pyro, I swear. Other examples of modern-day low-poly horror games include Cry of Fear, Iron Lung, Fears to Fathom, Paratopic, and if you can even count it as a game, Petscop, which uses the medium of Let's Plays to tell a story about a never-released-before PS1 game for kids that contains some disturbing secrets. And right next to low-poly horror, creepy RPG Maker games have subsequently found their place within the indie horror landscape. While you probably recognize these familiar art styles and RPG aesthetics from games like Earthbound or Final Fantasy or Pokemon, what sets these games apart is their use of horror and unsettling imagery. The thing that's interesting about these kinds of games is that they sort of like to keep the twist of horror a hidden factor. Okay, maybe not completely hidden, but when you boot up these kinds of games and first see the format and art style, you don't normally associate horror with it, or at least I personally don't. The whole idea of RPG horror is a complete subversion of expectation, and that's what makes these games so brilliant. A more popular example of this phenomenon is the recently released RPG Amori, which half the internet currently won't shut the fuck up about. Subversion of expectation is practically the name of the game with this shit. I mean, you'll spend an hour or so wandering around doing shit like this just to have random 20-minute segments of absolute fucking nightmare fuel. I guess another reason why these kinds of feelings come up when we play video games is that they are a much more interactive and personal medium as compared to books and movies. When consuming media such as the latter two examples, there's really not a whole lot of interaction. The story just kinda happens and you just have to sit there and observe it. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but generally you don't see too many creepypastas based around movies as compared to video games. In games, you can sort of craft your own experience and not feel as if you're locked into an observing position. But as a direct side effect of that personal attachment, your brain can kinda do that thing that it likes to do and make up shit to scare you. Like, I don't know if it happens to anyone else, but I'll be sitting in my house alone sometimes and hear my washing machine go off randomly and instantly start thinking that Alec Baldwin's gonna pop out of my hallway with a gun. All combined with the nostalgia factor that we carry around with a lot of old video games, it sort of combines with this previously established fear of the unknown to create a clusterfuck of emotions. And while unintentional horror is still a tad strange to talk about, I still find it incredibly interesting and fun to investigate around. I have a giant soft spot for video games in my brain, along with horror, so having this aspect in culture around this kind of thing has been something I've grown pretty fond of over the past couple of years. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. One of the big things that inspired me to make this video were Twitter pages I found surrounding aesthetics of old video games and their usage of liminal spaces. And even if people might declare these kinds of aesthetics in games a fad or simply just a trend, it's still much more interesting than any more pathetic, half-assed AAA horror game we get to see barfed out every couple of years. In conclusion, I am always right, and the internet is always wrong. As always, thanks for watching, please take a shower, and consider subscribing. Please. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some quirky horror games to play. Whee!